All right, today we want to talk about how to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. Now, on the last lesson, what we did is we solved equations that were perfect squares. So for example, on the left, this equation's a perfect square. All we have to do is if there's a squared here to undo it, is take the square root of each side. So to undo squaring, take the square root of each side. So this would give us x minus 3 equals 4, or x minus 3 equals negative 4. And from there, we would solve each side of the equation, both equations. We'd add 3 here. So x equals 7. Or when we add 3 here, we get x equals negative 1. So our two solutions to that quadratic equation to solve with perfect squares is x equals 7 or x equals 1. Now the idea of solving a quadratic equation by completing the square is that we can make any equation that we would like look like this one. We can make it look like it's got a perfect squared on one side by doing a process called completing the square. So if you look at this one, we've got x squared plus 6x plus what we want to do is figure out what number, when we add it to both sides, is going to make this a perfect square trinomial. We can manipulate it. We can find the number that would make this a perfect square and add it to both sides so it's balanced, and then we'll have a perfect square equation that we can solve. And if you remember, the way to get this number that you add to both sides is to take half the middle term. So if I take half of 6, okay, which is 3, and I square that, that value 9, that's the value that if I add it to this quadratic equation right here, I've got a perfect square. So if I do that to both sides, now what I have over here just became x plus 3 squared equals 18. Okay, so from there on, then I've just done the process of completing the square. Now I just solve it like I did the problems on the last lesson, where you take the square root of each side and so on. Okay, but that's the idea of solving by completing the square, is figuring out what number do I have to add to both sides to make it a perfect square. So let's look at this example here. If I want to complete the square, that means I want to find what number should be added to both sides to make this a perfect square right here. So I can write it as something squared. Okay. The idea, again, is if you want to write it down, take half of the middle term. So in this case, it's 8 over 2, which is 4, and then square that. Square the result. So then 4 squared is 16. So if I add 16 to both sides, okay, I'm going to be able to create a perfect square that I can solve. So the numbers that go in here are always the square roots of each one. So the square root of x squared is x, the square root of 16 is 4, and the sign is determined by whatever. This could be a minus, but in this case it's a plus. So whatever the sign is here for the middle term, that's the same sign that's on your binomial squared. So we've got x plus 4 squared equals 26. And then from there we go on and do the process of solving a quadratic equation with a perfect square. Take the square root of each side. All right, but the first quiz on Apex on section 3.5.3 is just, so if you look at 3.5.3 right now, that's just asking you what number should I add to each side to make it a perfect square trinomial. So they're looking in this case for the 16. They're going to ask you what number should be added to both sides to complete the square. And the other question they ask you need to know for the quiz on 3.5.3 is they're going to say, write the equation that would need to be solved to complete the square. And so they just want you to write this much of it. They don't want you to actually even solve it yet. So if you feel comfortable with this idea of how to find the number to make it a perfect square, take half the middle term and then square that and add that to both sides, and then you're able to put it, at least go this far to put it in this form, you should be ready to take the quiz on 3.5.3.